All right, so we are going to be talking about operations on complex numbers. That means you add, subtract, multiply, and divide them. So let's first talk about imaginary numbers first, right? We dealt with imaginary numbers before, so like 5i is an imaginary number, and I want to add that to like a negative 7i. Okay, so I is like a variable to us, right? So it's just like 5x plus negative 7x. You can add them because you have x and x. Here you have I and I. So you add them, you just have negative 2i, okay? And the same rule applies for subtracting, right? So you have like 5i minus 6i. 5i minus 6i gives you negative I. All right, so simple enough, guys. Just treat it like a variable, okay? If you multiply them, it's a little bit trickier. So if you have 5i times 6i, so here you multiply, so 5 times 6 is 30. And treat it like a variable. You have, if you have 5x times 6x, you have 30x squared, right? Here you have 30i squared because I times I is I squared. But remember, I squared is, you guys remember how I is radical negative 1 and I squared is negative 1, right? So I squared is negative 1. You have to remember that. So that gives you 30 times negative 1, which gives you negative 30. If you have division, which we won't deal with too much, so you have like 10i divided by 2i. The i's can cancel each other, which gives you 10 over 2, which is 5. Okay, so that's imaginary numbers. Okay, now what happens is if you have like a real number, like 6, and you add that to an imaginary number. Okay, so here you have 6 plus 4i. This part has an I, it's imaginary. Imaginary. And the top part here is the real part. If you have a real part adding to an imaginary part, you cannot add them together. Okay, you can't have like 10i. That makes no sense because this one is not I, it's just 6. So when you have these two together, they don't really mix. They just get stuck like that. And we call this a complex number. Okay, a complex number has the real part and imaginary part. Okay, and let's learn how to add and subtract them. All right. So I have 6i. I mean 6 plus 4i. That is one that one complex part. Okay, it's just there. This thing is like together. And you have plus 7 plus 5i, for example. Okay, so if you want to add these, you add the real part. So you have 6 plus 7 gives you 13. The real part is 13. And then you add the imaginary part. That gives you 9i. I want to do another one with like negative so you guys can see. So I have 6 plus 4i plus 7 minus 5i. Okay, so this is a complex number. This is another complex number. So when you add them, you add the real parts. That gives you 13. And here you have 4i minus 5i gives you negative I. Okay, so that is the final complex number. All right, let's go on to do the subtraction. If I have the same thing, so 7 plus 4i minus 5 minus 6i. Okay, so remember the subtraction means you take this thing here, subtract the thing in the back, right? Instead of adding, you're subtracting. So 7 minus 5 is 2. This is where you want to be careful though, because you might have negatives back here. So subtracting a negative, that becomes a positive. So 4i minus a negative 6i. So that's like 4i minus a negative 6i. That becomes a plus, right? That gives you a positive 10i. So when you're doing adding and subtracting complex numbers, be careful about the sign, okay? And the last one that we're doing today, we're not doing division, we're just doing multiplication, okay? So the last one we're doing is multiplying. So I have 5 plus 2i times 4 minus 3i. Okay. So this one is like foiling. You know, you have x and a number, they don't mix. So when you multiply, you have to take that, multiply to that, take that, multiply to that, and then take this, multiply to that, and this, multiply to that, right? Sometimes they call this FOIL. Sometimes they do the area model like this, whichever way you're comfortable with, right? So you can do it this way, like 5 and 2i, and then 4 and negative 3i. Then you do 20 and 8i. Here you have negative 15i. Here you have negative 6i squared. You know, or you can do it this way. So this one, 5 times 4 is 20, plus 5 times negative 3i is negative 15i. And then 2i times 4 is 8i. And then 2i times negative 3i is negative 6i squared. Okay, you get the same thing here. And then you got to combine the I with the I, the middle term. So you have 20 minus 7i minus 6i squared. But you remember I squared is always equal to negative 1. So you have 20 minus 7i minus 6 times negative 1. That gives you 20 minus 7i plus 6. And then this becomes a real number, right? So real number, you can combine them. That gives you 26 minus 7i. Okay, so the trick about multiplying complex numbers is you have to remember the I squared in the last term becomes a negative 1 right there. So that becomes a real part and combined with the real part in the beginning. I will do one more. You can stop here if you feel like you got it, but I'll do one more. So I have 4 minus 2i times 7 minus 5i. All right, so here I have 28, all right, minus 20i minus 14i plus 10i. Okay, so I combine these in the back. So 28 minus 34i. Oh, this should have been I squared. Sorry, that was I squared because I times I. So that becomes 10 times negative 1 because I squared is negative 1. So you have 28 minus 34i minus 10. And you combine that with that, that gives you 18 minus 34i. The next one we'll do division of complex numbers.